Welcome to The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Monday, July the 27th, 2020. With me here today on this edition of the podcast is Paula GomezStordy. She is the Senior Director of Training and Technical Assistance of the National Latino Network of Casa De Esperanza. Thank you so much, Paula, for being with me here today.
Omar, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you. I have spoken with you before and really could talk to you forever. So it's my absolute pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you so much, Paula. It's really great to have you here. Obviously, there's a lot of things that Casa De Esperanza does. It's an organization that has several chapters, and we're going to be talking, I guess, on an entry level about domestic violence. And by the way, I should say before I ask you for your thoughts about the conversation and the subject matter, to people listening, you may find the conversation or aspects of it to be triggering in some way. I don't know. I mean, we are not going to be talking about anything graphic or anything like that. We're going to be talking on a fundamental entry level about these issues. But for some people who are survivors, or if you're listening, there may be something about that. So I want to just use that as a preface to to add the maximum amount of sensitivity that we can have in a conversation like this, Paula. So, and I think that's important to mention.
It is, Omar. Thank you for mentioning it. Yes, it includes violence. We're talking about intimate partner violence, and so that is triggering and difficult to hear. Sometimes it may be difficult to recognize some parts of our relationships when we talk about intimate partner violence. It's also difficult if we have memories of growing up in a home where there was violence, or someone witnessed violence. And so, however you've experienced or witnessed violence, if this conversation is triggering, what is most important is that you take care of yourself, right? To have that awareness of okay, this might be too hard for me at this moment, and I need to take care of myself and what makes me feel safe, what people make me feel safe, what are the things that make me feel safe. And so if you need to talk to someone, if you need to pause and come back, we encourage you to do that. My hope today is that although there are extreme images that we may think about when we hear intimate partner violence, domestic violence, my hope is to explore domestic violence in a broader sense and expand that discussion to things that are not so obvious, that impact our lives, that is part of intimate partner violence, but that we don't deem it as such because there's stereotypes of what it is, who is impacted, and who perpetuates or who uses violence in their relationships. There are images that we have in the media. And so when it doesn't fit, then we sort of negate, well, it couldn't be that because we don't fit that, or I don't fit that, or my experience doesn't fit that. So what I'd also like to include in this discussion is freedom, right? Well-being and safety, love. What does that feel like, right? And when is that jeopardized?
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate what you've just said here, because those are so key. Those are fundamentally key. And a lot of times we do talk about this subject in a very narrow prism, and we don't add those very important elements and components that you have just supplied to the conversation. So I'm thankful, and I know the people listening are thankful for what you've just said in particular, because you want to give this conversation the maximum kind of context and sincerity and honesty, but also compassion and empathy while you help people. And so thank you for that. Can we talk just briefly about Casa De Esperanza and the kinds of resources and the kinds of tools that the organization offers and the communities that are offered them?
Absolutely, thank you. So Casa De Esperanza is over 35 years old, 37 years. We celebrate 37 years of serving the community. And it was founded by 5 Latina activists, community activists in St. Paul, Minnesota. And it was their response to survivors of intimate partner violence. And I will say interchangeably, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, gender-based violence as we have this conversation. But Latinas who were experiencing abuse and violence in their relationships. And started off as a shelter program. And the values that we have is really listening to the community, listening to the people we support, to guide us so that we are relevant in what we provide. And women said, that's great, but we are receiving support, but we'd also like you to work with our children and also work with our partners who have used abuse, right? Because if what I'm receiving is helping, I want also my family to be supported. So that really is a different way of working with domestic violence and supporting victims of domestic violence, and I'll get to that in a minute, of how there are other ways of working. It is grounded as well in a culturally specific way, in a group-oriented way, and that community and family is important. And so if we're working with the survivor, we also need to work with the family that's around the survivor, and that also includes the individual who's causing the harm. So we began to expand our services to work with the family. We call that family advocacy, where we provide support, also advocacy within the courts if they need to go to court or to the police, also with other systems, whether it be child welfare or housing or any issue that impacts someone's well-being. And we have a community engagement initiative program where we are listening to the community by listening sessions, where we ask the community what is best for them. We listen, and then we go back to the community and say, did we get this right? Is that what you said? And then we then create programs or support the leadership of the community. And sometimes we do have programs, and other times we may not even start a program, but support the leadership of the community so that that leadership of the community has tools to also educate their peers and provide that support. We believe that violence will only end when the community is involved in ending it, that institutions provide services, but institutions will not end violence. It is the community, it is people. And so, Casa De Esperanza applied in 2006 for a federal grant to provide services across the country with training and technical assistance. And we provide domestic violence training as well as culturally specific services. How does one respond in a culturally responsive way, since not one fits all? And later we were awarded a grant by the Department of Health and Human Services, and we are the National Culturally Specific Latino Resource Center. We're part of 26 resource centers, and we have a national a project called the National Latino Network. And within the network, we have three goal areas. And one is research that is culturally responsive, also community-based. It's participatory research. We also have an advocacy in DC that we do. And then we also have the training and technical assistance program, where we provide training to organizations, both culturally specific organizations and mainstream. Culturally specific organizations are Latino-led, Latinx-led, and provide services to the Latino community and in any assistance that they may need on program development or volunteer recruitment or whatever it is that they may need support, we provide that support to them. And also with mainstream organizations, we provide technical assistance and training on how to respond in a culturally responsive way.
Yeah, I'm sitting here and I am thinking there's so many things that your organization does that, my goodness, it's a broad umbrella, Paula.
Yes.
And I hope that people who are listening to us do start to get a grasp of just how broad, as you've pointed out, the subject is and the kinds of things resource-wise are, and those avenues and those layers that are supplemented with the kinds of work that your organization does. We enter this point now of talking about intimate partner violence and domestic violence. Maybe one of the ways to start speaking about this on this episode is to talk about what it is or what the misconceptions are. Maybe there's an entry point to the conversation. Maybe there's a way to get to that. Maybe you can offer, Paula, a way to contour that, because, we can talk about what the misconceptions are, what it is. I mean, I think intrinsically people think they know what it is, but it takes on so many forms. So, that's a challenge, I think. But what would you like to say about that? What kinds of thoughts do you have? I mean, domestic violence is what? If someone came up to you and asked you that question, how would you begin to answer it?
It's a good question. So I've been in the field of domestic violence and sexual assault for about 25 years. And I'm grateful to say that there's been lots of changes in our field and lots of changes in the community to recognize what domestic violence is, what abuse is. And so domestic violence, usually I would say it's an imbalance of power within an intimate relationship where one party uses violence of many forms to gain power and control over their partner. And violence includes physical violence, emotional, economic, verbal, threats, depending on the individual's identity as well. Threats of coercion, such as deportation. If you leave me, I will deport you. Threats of outing someone. If you leave me, I will tell everyone that we're not just roommates, that you're my partner. So controlling their partner. Someone's life who's being impacted by abuse gets smaller. They're isolated. And someone who is perpetuating abuse has those rights and moves around and freely says and does what they want in their relationship. What's important is to look at the issue of power, right? Because in the context of that relationship, there may be an imbalance of power. Yet that individual that is perpetuating the violence may have social capital may have power or may not have power, depending on their identity, who they are. Someone may say, yes, I have used violence, but I don't have power. I don't have power in society. I don't have power at work. I don't have a job, right? If I get pulled over, I have no power if I get pulled over by the police. So yes, that it might be the case, right? That is the case, is that when we look at power in society versus you look at relationship. It's also what I want to say, and if we could spend, we can go on to the next question if you'd like, but what I do want to say is very important is what we see in the media and conversations. This is not black and white. This is not good or bad. This is an individual who causes harm, an individual who has been in a relationship, who has also exhibited good behavior, warm behavior, loving behavior. And that's what's confusing. Because a person who has experienced that knows, okay, my partner is a good parent, or there was a good time, or it's always been sort of difficult, but I know that I'm loved, or what have you. Or they're a good person in the community. What's important is to accept or to know that there are two things that can happen at the same time. And I feel that the media, or we, sometimes as people, we vilify. We say if someone were ever to raise their hand to someone else, then they are the worst. Right? Or someone who would ever perpetuate sexual abuse is the worst kind of human being. And they're awful, and they're almost a monster, and should be in jail for life. Now, if I believe that, and I'm a survivor, and someone has abused me sexually, there's a lot of responsibility that I now have in shame, and also knowing how this individual is perceived in the community as a good person. And if only bad people do this, and this, I question whether it was or not. If that's what I said earlier with stereotypes, if I am a strong woman, then it certainly cannot be happening to me, because the stereotype of a woman who's experienced abuse is someone who's shy, someone who's not strong, someone who's meek, who has low self-esteem. Certainly that can't happen to me. So that's why I'd like for us to caution, how these stereotypes of people, but instead to look at when, or to have an understanding, when do I feel freedom? When do I feel safe? Who makes me feel supported and who doesn't, right? And maybe it's not so easy. Maybe I'm just confused when I get off the phone with someone. Or maybe I doubt myself every time I'm with someone. So that's what I think is important, is to look at how we perceive these individuals, on the stereotype of these players and what it is, and instead have more of an honest conversation and dig more.
And I think that what you're saying is absolutely something that I notice a tremendous absence of in media. Because, as you point out, there's this very black and white approach, the need to have a good guy versus bad guy, good woman versus bad woman, and no shades of gray, because the nuance is what I think terrifies people, or terrifies some people. And those individuals in power who run media, because the corporate news media is run by obviously very powerful individuals, they have interests that are different, obviously, from the interests of those who are not only being survivors, but also people in general who want a more concrete or more nuanced approach, I should say, with the kinds of education that we need. Because this is also about education, and that's one thing I'm learning from you. That this is about educating people, which is why, and I asked you about what domestic violence is. I mean, it seems like such a broad and general question, but it allows us to get to what you've just talked about, which is these very, very clear other things that go on around it, because it does involve a community. It does involve groups of people. It is not just about the survivor alone and what she, in the vast majority of cases, and you've talked about gendered violence and all kinds of other types of violence as well, but usually what she experiences and goes through, there are other people that this impacts. There are other family members that impacts. This impacts work. This impacts so many areas of the lives of people. And so I do understand exactly where you're coming from. And we can talk a bit about that, because the messaging that people get about the whole idea, culture of domestic violence is really a disservice to us when we don't explore that these are facets of the abuser. So the abuser has these different facets, usually a him, a he, right? I mean, is that what you're getting at, talking about these facets of an abuser, which also feeds into the complications around what this is, because a woman typically in this situation is trusting this person who says to her, well, I'm not going to do that again to you. And then there are these sides of, as you point out, the loving side, the compassionate side, and all of these other things that go on, plus economics. You've got that as a very coercive factor. And you talked about power earlier, and about, well, you know, I don't really have any power. I'm not at a Fortune 500 company. I'm not a politician. I'm not a cop. You know, I've been pulled over by them, whatever that response might be. But in that moment, that person does have power, because, as you point out, this is about power and violence. This is not about anything else. It's a power dynamic, and it's a destructive one. And the economic component, because people say, well, why does she stay? Why does she stay? And there's so many reasons for that too. So there's those externalized complexities, and then the internalized ones, which you're talking about, I think, with the abuser themselves and how that person may have suffered abuse in the past. I mean, it's such a tricky and challenging thing, but it's a necessary thing to explore, because these are people. I mean, as much as I might personally be repulsed by them, and I am, and people listening are repulsed by individuals like this, they still have a backstory of their own. And we live in a culture and a society that says, throw away the key. You know, they don't get to have a redemptive aspect to them. I think what you're saying, you can tell me if I'm wrong, is that we should be looking at both individuals or all of the individuals involved, even beyond the two people involved. We need to look at the whole village, the whole community around them as well. But we need to also look at the abuser, and I don't know if study is the word, but to also get them the help that they need, which is what I think you said at the beginning of our conversation.
Yes. Yes, to all of it. And I just want to go back a little bit in terms of the media. When I said these images that we see in the media, we've seen these images in the media. And at the same time, the media is such an opportunity for education, because we are immersed in it, whether it's TV or it's social media or print media, whatever it is. There's lots of coverage of the topic that has then helped survivors say, you know that clip, or do you know that movie that happened to me? And so when it's so difficult, there's shame in talking about abuse, whether it's in the relationship or whether it's sexual abuse, is to say there's shame about coming forward and saying this happened to me. And so that the media does have this opportunity, and it's a strong tool, medium to use to educate, right? And so more voices, survivor voices, that are writing stories, that are producing stories, more diverse angles of it, is absolutely something that is going to support this discussion, right? And also provide information such as prevention, right? And talking about what is healthy, what is a good relationship. Because there are also bad relationships that may not be abusive, right? There's you just bring out the worst in each other.
Right.
Right? But yet there's no fear in the relationship.
Right.
You know, there's no you could have your own autonomy, right? It's not a good relationship, right?
Right.
And also to talk more about what is a good relationship, what's a healthy relationship, what's a healthy disagreement or argument where we're both heard, right? Or where we might need a break, right? How are we able to show disappointment, anger, frustration without fear, without someone fearing us, right? When we do that. And so that's what I wanted to say about media, and that, yes, more diverse voices in media is a helpful tool. I also want to say that when we have that in social media, where individuals and survivors and community have a voice and have a camera, that really has shifted communities, such as Me Too, right? The Me Too movement, or Time's Up, or Say Her Name, Black Lives Matter. Right? We all have an opportunity to talk about these things and provide awareness and education through social media. And so I just wanted to say media is a powerful tool that is also there for good. What I wanted to mention in what you talked a little bit earlier, and the domestic violence movement certainly has done this, and referring to the individual who perpetuates, who uses harm, who uses violence in the relationship as the abuser, and many programs do to today. Or will call the individual the batterer, because this movement came from the battered women's movement, right? Where the woman was the victim, the man was the perpetrator, the person causing harm, right? And so programs would refer to the individual who's seeking services as the victim, and the person who harmed as the abuser. The police, in the courts, it is the victim of a case, of a criminal case, and the person who caused harm, allegedly caused harm, is the defendant, right, within the courts. But within services, advocates would call, and still do, call that individual a batterer or an abuser. And for some survivors, a little bit surprising, difficult to call someone that you had a relationship with, erase their name or their identity and only refer to them as the abuser, right? It's not natural conversations outside of this program to call your partner my abuser. Although that is done within support groups or with engaging with programs. Yet, so it just to what we do at Casa De Esperanza is to really listen to survivors, right? And how are they referring to their partner who caused them harm? And to recognize the individual, the totality of the individual, right? And so what is the solution? What is the solution for this? If we look at systems, the person who caused harm gets arrested, right?
Right.
You refer supportive services to the victim to go to counseling, right? Or to go to a support group, or even go to shelter. to leave. If there are children and that children can't be kept safe, then they go to foster care. So then you have jail, foster care, shelter. 3 systems, all separate. From a group-oriented culture, that's not appealing if the only way that this can be resolved is for me to leave everything I know and go into a shelter. And I understand that individuals that are in that position don't have the resources to go anywhere else for their safety and will go to a shelter. But the first approach is not one that supports the family and community as a whole, right? It's institutions. And so for Latino survivors, it's leaving their community where they may have spoken their own language. They had a community or neighbors and so forth. When I first started working 25 years ago in the district attorney's office with victims of crime, often, my role was to support the victim in the case, is to say, what is it that you would like to happen? And almost always I would hear, especially from Latinas, they would say, I don't want my partner to go to jail. I just want the abuse to stop. Or no, if he goes to jail, who's going to pay the rent? Who's you going to pay my diapers? I'm going to lose the apartment. And so there's this dependency, financial dependency as well. And so we look at punishment. We look at the solution of being punishment, as opposed to looking at the survivor and what is it that the survivor needs. I mean, there's different approaches, and there's a whole movement, a different way of looking at it in terms of restorative justice and transformative justice, where if the individual is held accountable, goes to jail, what is the impact on the individual? What is the impact on the survivor? Is there healing? Is there transformation? And ultimately, that's what an individual wants. Healing, transformation, repair, recovery. And so I think having more the voices of survivors central in policies, right, and in responses will be more effective.
And will open up the door to the more nuanced conversations that we should be having, because, as you've just pointed out, there is a very punitive type of demeanor that comes across in the quote-unquote system that you allude to. In prosecutorial ways, it's all about, boom, throw the key away after you've locked the jail cell or the prison cell. Whereas if you center this idea of restorative justice and the things you've just described to the audience around the survivor and the perspective of the survivor, you are probably, I'm sure you're going to have a much more nuanced and much more open look at what can happen to that person who has done this violence as well, because you do have to look at the survivor. This is going to impact the survivor, tremendously. You talked about economics. I raised it earlier too. There's this economic coercion, and having the survivor at the center of deciding or informing us what should be done, I think is enormously valuable.
Yes, and there are some processes where that happens, where there's a victim impact statement, where once there's a case and there is a conviction, the survivor is allowed to share their story or words, or someone can read it on their behalf that the court provides. And my role often was to support victims in that victim impact statement. I also want to acknowledge that there are times when survivors call the police because they're in fear at that moment of violence and want to interrupt the violence. There are times where the individual does not feel safe if that partner is out in the loose, let's say. I've also worked with families that have lost loved ones because they were killed because of domestic violence. So I do want to acknowledge that as well, right? And that there are individuals that call the police for safety, to interrupt the violence, and to have someone detained so that they feel safe. What I mean about prior when I spoke is we have to look at systems that are also transformative and healing, right? And that not all of these, there's this way of looking at cases to assess the lethality of a case. And that is a different scenario, the one that I was talking about, when someone is looking at, okay, I believe that this person is going to kill me. And I think that that's essential to hear the voices of survivors. Survivors know best, right? They're day in and day out. They've studied and they've tried to figure out how to stay safe. If I do it this way, maybe I'll avoid an argument. If I do it this other way. And so programs, domestic violence programs, work with survivors on safety, enhancing their safety. It's called a safety plan. And that safety plan should always come from the words and ideas of the survivor, right? The survivor knows best. Well, that happened, you call the police. Well, in my scenario, I can't call the police because, for many reasons, let's say, I'm afraid if I don't have papers, I'm going to get deported. Or I have a warrant out for my arrest because of some bad checks, or because there was destruction of property in a fight. And now my landlord, I don't have, and I still have that pending. So whatever reason, again, not one size does not fit all. And so asking someone about their safety when supporting someone is essential, right? Because someone might say, yes, that's the best way. If I get a restraining order, I know my partner will abide by the restraining order because they're afraid to get arrested or for whatever reason. Someone else may say, no, I've already had 3 restraining orders and they're violated, right? It's not going to work for me.
Right.
So in the micro of working with survivors, it's important to always have the survivor voice lead to enhance that safety. And with looking at systems and policies and laws, it also is essential to have survivor voices of what has helped, right? What has helped also, the unspoken of children who witness the violence and are impacted by the violence, right? Years ago, I was a shelter director, and to see the incredible impact that abuse had on children, where their natural developmental stages sometimes were stunned because of the fear, right? If I am in fear, I have to have all of my focus on staying safe as opposed to being open and growing and evolving. And so there were children that could not speak. There were other children that were older that would wet their beds. There were children that had this intense separation anxiety, leaving their mother. What will happen to my mother, right? Also children that are parentified of trying to protect their mother. Teenagers that were angry, and also teenagers that were incredibly parentified and protective and very gentle, right? And so to know then, and it started off having three months. Individuals, families could be there 3 months, which was really nothing for the family. In 3 months, a family cannot be stable to then have their own apartment. And so especially if they weren't able to work. And so it realistically was sometimes 6 months to a year. I mean, housing is so expensive in Massachusetts. and across the country.
Mm-hmm.
And so the economics, right? If someone's in a shelter, are they able to work? Years ago, there were in some shelters across the country, if you're there, you're not able to work. You can't go back to work because then your abuser, quote unquote, will follow you, right? And that's also happens in abuse. But all these rules for safety really were difficult to have economic empowerment. And so realistically, it wasn't enough to do 3 months, right? But even at 3 months, when children had a consistent stability of of an environment that was safe, and also having trauma-informed counseling that understood the impact of trauma on the brain, along with advocacy, domestic violence advocacy, and I saw the healing of children.
Mm.
And that gives me hope. That gave me hope. What gives me hope, too, is that 20 years ago or 25 years ago, I would speak about domestic violence only within my domestic violence world. And now it feels like our community, right, individuals everywhere are able to have a conversation or bring it up.
Mm-hmm.
It used to be a private matter, a family issue you don't talk about. It's almost disrespectful to talk about it, right? But now there's this openness about it. So I do have hope. I have hope that men are joining in this work, right? I have hope that we are inclusive about expanding our lens of supporting communities, right? And that gives me hope.
Oh, that's really great. And we could keep talking forever. I really thank you so much for sharing your perspectives, experiences, and insights. And we will have to have, Paula, a follow-up conversation where we can travel to other destinations and areas around this subject matter and the more expansive things that you have teased out here over the last duration of time that we've spent here talking. My guest today has been Paula GomezStordy, and she is the Senior Director of Training and Technical Assistance at the National Latino Network of Casa De Esperanza. One thing I want to say, if you can please provide the webpage of your organization, it'd be lovely.
Thank you so much, Omar. It's a pleasure. Like I said at the beginning, I could speak to you forever. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to mention our website. And our website is the National Latino Network.org. Also, if you've been listening and you want to learn more or talk to someone, there is the National Domestic Violence Hotline that you can look up. It's also their website is wonderful. It's National Domestic Violence Hotline.org. And also, every state has a coalition, a domestic violence and a sexual assault coalition. Go to your state's domestic violence or sexual assault coalition to find a statewide hotline. Individuals that there are trained advocates that speak to survivors or loved ones of survivors that have questions that want to inform themselves. You can also call that hotline, and it's there for you 24 hours. It also they provide in various languages.
Thank you so very much, Paula. Once again, Paula GomezStordy. She is the Senior Director of Training and Technical Assistance at the National Latino Network of Casa De Esperanza. Thank you so much for the conversation today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Omar.